I'm going to read. I don't like doing that. I much prefer to talk, but I would then go on well beyond the 45 minutes I'm allowed. So, I'm going to read a paper to you. I hope that I'm reading won't make this any less exciting. On the 12th of December, 1929, Wilhelm Reich gave a lecture to the inner circle of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Association on the prevention of neuroses. And you can read this passage from Function of the Orgasm about this. Psychoanalytic treatment at best could only have impact on a distinct minority of the population. Freud and his colleagues knew this and attempted to broaden the population of those who benefited from psychoanalysis by starting a free clinic, the ambulatorium. You can read about that in this book. At the clinic, analysts would donate at least an hour every week giving free therapy to members of the working class. Given his own personal experiences with abject poverty as a medical student, Reich and his younger brother lived in a single room together that was unheated. It's not surprising that he was drawn to the free clinic, and before long, Reich became an assistant director of it. But still, even free therapy to the working classes was a very small drop in the bucket over and against the deeply entrenched social, political, and religious values of Catholic Austria. In the East, revolution was in the air. With the Russian Revolution of 1917 came the promise of an economic revolution that would address widespread poverty, but also a social revolution that would eliminate religious domination and traditional authoritarian patriarchy. Reich lived in Vienna for 12 years. Politically, it was dominated by the Austrian Social Democrats. They were Marxist, but strongly anti-communist. Vienna was known as Red Vienna, and the city was clearly the most socialist in Europe outside of the Soviet Union. Reich, like many psychoanalysts, was a member of the Social Democratic Party. In July 1927, following a scandalous acquittal of some Christian socials, that was the dominant conservative political party, some Christian socials had shot and killed some Social Democrats and got off scot-free. Riots spread in Vienna, the Palace of Justice was set afire, and Reich watched firsthand as the local police shot into the crowds. Over 80 people were killed and 1,000 wounded. Social Democratic police shooting Social Democratic workers in the streets. Furious with the passivity of the Social Democrats as Social Democratic leaders and their tendency to attempt compromise with the right-wing Christian socials, Reich secretly joined the Communist Party. Those are the three political groups at that time. You can read about this in People in Trouble, Reich's book, People in Trouble. The original Orgonomy Press and then the revision. Back to 1929 and Reich's presentation on prophylaxis, on prevention rather than treatment. In the beginning of that year, together with communist physician Marie Frischoff, Reich founded the Socialist Society for Sex Counseling and Research, a small group of physicians, educators, and lawyers who gave lectures and provided their own free clinics. In August of that year, Reich spent a month living in Moscow. He lectured and visited schools and factories. Whatever reservations Reich had, by this time Stalin was well entrenched enough to banish Trotsky, who was the former head of the Red Army, Reich wrote a very positive account of his study tour, given orally in November 1929, and later published in the Psychoanalytic Movement. You can read this article in the collection, The Sex Pole Essays. And now I lost my place. A key feature of this study tour centered on Reich's optimistic hope that the social revolution would begin the demise of the patriarchal family, and with it, the end of the engine of neuroses, the dreaded Oedipus complex. In the notes about his tour, he refers to a speech before the Communist Academy where he attacked the psychoanalytic dogma of the universality of the Oedipus complex. Quote, even the Oedipus relationship is not a biological but a social phenomenon determined by the patriarchal structure of the family. Reich wrote very much the same thing in his essay once again from 1929, the essay Dialectical Materialism in Psychoanalysis. You can read a later edition of this in that Sex Pole collection as well. In that article, he cited for the first time the work of Malinowski, whose 1927 Sex and Repression in Savage Societies included an explicit critique of the Oedipus complex, and there was this whole controversy between Malinowski and Jones on the issue of the universality of the Oedipus complex. This book is actually really important to read, and part 3 is about the whole relationship between psychoanalysis and anthropology. Reich asserted that the Oedipus complex must disappear in a socialist society because its social basis, the patriarchal family, will itself disappear. The patriarchal family structure, the key, the linchpin, the focal point of human misery, and the source of all fascist ideology, or so Reich firmly believed. If it were possible to change social conditions, to eliminate the authoritarian role of the father in the family union, to eliminate the subservient role of women in the family and in society at large, for women and men to be on equal economic footing, equal pay for equal work, if abortion were legal so that parents would be in a better position to plan their families, if children would have equal status, whether or not they were conceived within a married unit or outside of marriage, eliminating the so-called illegitimacy. What a concept. If divorce were as easy as ripping up a piece of paper, if sexuality were embraced for all, regardless of age or orientation, there would be no Oedipus conflicts and no mass neuroses. It was precisely this vision that drew Reich to the communists, since all of these social ideals were legalized initially with the Russian Revolution. Abortion, legal. Homosexuality, decriminalized. Economic parity across gender. Marriage, no church weddings, no churches. Instead, marriage as simple as signing a card which could later be destroyed. Sadly, after Lenin's demise and Stalin's solidification of his hold on the Communist Party, things changed dramatically. And by 1936, these socially enlightened policies were whittled away and to a great extent destroyed. Back to 1929, an important and exciting year in Reich's deepening social and political vision. As I mentioned, in the very beginning of the year, Reich organized the Socialist Society for Sex Counseling and Research. In that same year, he published a book called Sexual Excitation and Sexual Satisfaction. It is the most widely circulated writing by Reich during his lifetime, more than any other of his books. over 10,000 copies were circulated. The English version is not yet in print, though there is a fine translation thanks to Dr. Jonathan Koblenzer. I will briefly, and I hope someday we'll get this into print, I will briefly say something about it, mainly because it gives you a taste of the kind of revolutionary thinking Reich was promoting at that time. The booklet begins with the claim that sexual misery cannot be alleviated by social programs as long as they remain within the confines of, quote, bourgeois social policy. Sexual distress can only be ended by the successful proletarian revolution. The economic and sexual go hand in hand. And this is a passage from Sexual Excitation. I don't like reading when it's on the screen. Could you know how to read? So quickly read it yourself, and I'll say my or if someone wants to dramatically read it, please, quickly.
A consistent analysis of the causes of sexual misery leads in a straight line to a devastating, revolutionary critique of the social order. The same is true of a consistent analysis of the causes of economic misery. Bourgeois social policy is incapable of addressing poverty because, objectively speaking, it cannot touch its root origin. Indeed, on the contrary, it disguises the true situation. Similarly, bourgeois sexual reform and so-called sexual enlightenment only signify a hopeless attempt to master the constantly growing crisis.
Thank you very much. You can see how revolutionary Reich's ideals were at the time. While capitalism is at the heart of sexual misery, the more immediate cause is the bourgeois conception of marriage, legally institutionalized and enforced, with its demand that sexual contact occur only within the marital unit, and where premarital and extramarital sexual contact is strictly verboten. Okay, marriage is not a natural phenomenon, but only emerges from the development of private property, has advanced to the point where the sexual connection between two humans can be treated as a commodity. The history of marriage begins with pillage and exchange. Women were stolen, bought, and sold. Women were the property of men, as they still are in bourgeois society. If that doesn't ring bells for you, Dr. Lewis has reminded us the source here, namely Frederick Engels. And it's very enlightening to read The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, that Engels constructed from notes from Marx. Marx himself never filled it out, but Marx had begun these ideas. And Reich talks about it to great extent in The Invasion of Compulsory Sex Morality. The bourgeois family, understood to be patriarchal, is not only the source of sexual misery, the oppression of women, the sexual double standard, it is also the prototype of the fascist state. The place where young people are trained to be, quote unquote, good citizens, to obey those in authority. For Reich, marriage has a political function as well as an economic and social one, and it is the political function that is, quote, the least acknowledged but certainly not the least important. It is the backbone of the bourgeois family, whose structure becomes the model for the bourgeois state. From an early age, the child absorbs bourgeois ideology. In this ideological factory, the child learns early to cower before the authority of the father, who is the model for all later authority. You can find that phrase, the ideological factory, in the opening chapters of the original 1933 Mass Psychology of Fascism. The role of the patriarchal family as the crucible out of which are forged obedient followers of authoritarian government leaders is one of the key elements of Reich's analysis of fascism. I wish we had more time to go into sexual excitation and sexual satisfaction in detail, but I do want to quote from the very final paragraphs in which Reich lays out his demands. These are the demands in the final chapter from sexual exploitation to sexual satisfaction. The young should be completely scientifically enlightened about everything from sexual life. And just to skip one moment, in 1932, Reich wrote The Sexual Struggle of Youth, and also in 1932, not written by Reich, but written by Annie Reich and others, wrote this little book for children. It's an incredible book. And in some ways, it's more revolutionary than The Sexual Struggle of Youth, since it addresses prepubescent children as opposed to adolescents. Going back here for a second. Reich argued that contraception should be distributed free of charge through health insurance. Well, we know how that's working out here in the United States with the Affordable Care Act, which now may be overturned by the Supreme Court to eliminate the coverage of contraception in the Affordable Care Act. Reich argued that the laws against abortion be completely rescinded. Well, we know where that's at. I mean, again, the Supreme Court, dominated by Catholics, is probably going to oversee Roe v. Wade. At least there's a lot of suspicion that it will happen. I don't want to belabor all of this to you. You understand this. By the way, the Club of Chalk Triangle is translated. There's a wonderful translation by Professor Strick and a colleague, Manfred Fugert, and I hope that too will get into print before long. It's a very important document. As for housing, come back. He talks about sexual life of unmarried youth be considered in housing allocations, and you may know that in Malinowski's exploration of the Trobriand Islanders, on these islands there would be common huts where young people could go and have privacy for their sexual activity. Maybe that's what happens in dormitories these days, but I'm not too sanguine about that. Sexual Excitation and Sexual Satisfaction was published in 1929. It came through 4 editions, and in 1930 it was banned successfully in Germany. This will not be the last of Reich's books to be banned. The lecture on prophylaxis that I began with was given on December 12, 1929. The very next night, Friday the 13th, Reich spoke before the organizing meeting of the, quote, Revolutionary Social Democrats, a left opposition to the Social Democratic Party. The meeting was attended in a large hall. Reich writes that there were 2,000 people in this hall. The building no longer exists. I wanted to see, I'm going to get 2,000 people there. The police say there were 1,500 people there. And by the way, the police monitored every single public event, and they actually become a very good source for historians because they write everything down and have all the numbers written down. At some point, this meeting of the Revolutionary Social Democrats degenerated into a wild riot with chairs being thrown and things like this. And you can see that in People in Trouble if you read People in Trouble, page 116. 2 weeks later, Reich was expelled from the Social Democratic Party. The first time he was expelled from an organization. There will be others. The following year, in 1930, Reich wrote Sexual Maturity, Abstinence, and Marital Morality, which is now available as part 1 of the Sexual Revolution. Once in Berlin, he moved there at the end of 1930. Reich continued his political activism. He gave public speeches, he taught classes at the MOSH, the Marxist Workers' School, and continued to write books challenging the social status quo. In addition to the book just mentioned, he also published The Sexual Struggle of Youth and The Invasion of Compulsory Sex Morality. Working along with members of the Communist Party, he drafted a pamphlet called Forbidden Love, Liebe wer will. This widely circulated pamphlet, over 100,000 copies were distributed, was the organizing tool of a communist front organization, the Unified Association for Proletariat Sexual Reform and the Protection of Motherhood. This is the organization that Reich refers to as his, quote, sexual political organization in People in Trouble. It was his in the sense that the ideology of this organization was drawn from Reich's writings, but it was not his in the sense that he was its explicit leader. Fortunately for him, because right after the burning of the Reichstag in the end of February 1933, all the leaders of the Einsatzgruppen were liquidated. They were shot and killed. And some of these were close friends of Reich's, and he knew this, and he was on the run. Returning back to the tension between prevention and treatment, it's worth considering the preface to the first edition of Character Analysis, dated by Reich as January 1933, Berlin. As a reminder, Hitler was made chancellor at the end of that month. In the preface, psychoanalyst, take heed, this is his character analysis. In the preface, Reich imagines a serious challenge to his entire enterprise. This is the original character analysis, which has the subtitle, Technique and Fundamentals for Studying and Practicing an Analyst. The most recent edition doesn't say that. But this is from the preface. Reich, wait, sorry. Somehow I skipped something. Well, it happens. He says, in a city the size of Berlin, there are millions of neurotic people whose psychic structures and capacity for work and pleasure have been severely impaired. Every hour of every day, fresh thousands of neuroses are produced by family, education, and social conditions. In view of the present lack of interest in such matters, is there any point in printing detailed material on individual analytic technique, relations between various psychic structures and character dynamics, and similar? So he considers that a challenge. Why are you doing this, given the incredible widespread neuroses before you? And then he responds, from a social point of view, the position of individual psychotherapy is hopeless. I have endeavored to demonstrate that neuroses are the results of a home atmosphere that is patriarchal and sexually suppressive. That, moreover, the only prophylaxis worth of serious consideration is one for the practical implementation of which the present social system lacks even the prerequisite. Turnover that will be dependent upon the outcome of a political struggle over a century, which will create the preconditions of an extensive prophylaxis of neuroses. Hence, it is clear that a prophylaxis of neuroses, a prevention, is out of question unless it is prepared theoretically. In short, that the study of the dynamic and economic conditions of human structures is its most important prerequisite. And now I'm picking up what I projected. To make a study of human structure in a way that would have relevance for the prophylaxis of neuroses, it is the first necessary to perfect our analytic technique. In other words, he's saying we need to have this information when we can actually implement it socially. We can implement it individually, but that's not going to do a damn bit of thing. We need to be able to apply this at large, and in the meanwhile, we're learning our new techniques. When I read this passage, I see a difference from the earlier assessments in the 1929 passages from Sexual Excitation and Sexual Satisfaction. There, I get the impression that he thought it was just simply a matter of time. We were going to do this. But now, in 1933, now that the Nazis are in power, he realizes this is not going to happen so quickly. At least we can at least do this. By this time, 1933, Reich was finished with Communist Party. but he still toyed with the idea of finding a different political party, one committed to a truly liberatory socialism. In October, while living in Copenhagen, he turned to Trotsky. Through letters, he introduced himself, sketched out his sexual political work in Germany, and the difficulties he had with the German Communist Party. He noted that he was still a member of the party, but anticipated his explosion, which in fact happened in November 1933. That's when he was thrown out of the party. Since, quote, the Communist Party cannot perform the sexual political work, it's not the right place, and since, quote, without the support of a political party, it cannot develop its fullest potential, at least that was his thinking at that time, Reich solicited Trotsky's interest in collaboration. Earlier, he had sent Trotsky a copy of Mass Psychology of Fascism. Quote, I'm asking for your opinion, and in case of your fundamental agreement, for your political and organizing help, he says to Trotsky. Voicing doubt about any future possible unification of the various factions of the Communist Party, lots of different factions, he confesses that he could not, quote, yet a clear opinion about the founding of the new party. Though Reich was about to separate from the Communist Party proper, he was still looking for a political home, a longing that would continue for some time. At one point in People in Trouble, Reich offers an explanation as to why he stayed with the Communist Party long after he came to see the rigidity of its leadership and problems of its policy. He says in People in Trouble, against my better judgment, I myself clung fast to the organization to which I had belonged and for which I had fought. The party became my second home. Are you waving something? 50 more? Oh, good. So let me know when it's 5. One of the reasons, one of the virtues of writing things out, you can do a conversion from words to time. So I know that I'm under 45 minutes, I hope, but then I'm now improvising. In any case, Trotsky had no interest then. Later, in 1936, there was a meeting, a secret meeting between Reich and Trotsky, but that's a different story. Save it for another time. I'm sorry, you'll have to suffer. Or read my book. Trotsky showed no interest in getting together with Reich for a new political party. The closest Reich came to what you could call a political party was the circle of people around his own journal, the Journal of Political Psychology and Sex Economy, and its offshoot, a private circulated bulletin. The first thing, the Zeitschrift is available in German, completely, I think, but not the newsletter, and I think this newsletter is also very, very important. But I think everything is important. In 1935, Reich published anonymously a book called The Masses and the State. It is an explicit attack on Stalinism. So in 1935, he's now in Norway, he didn't pull any punches, and in 1936, he writes the Sexuality in the Cultural Struggle on the Socialist Restructuring of Humanity, which, when it gets translated into English, is the Sexual Revolution. But note the subtitles. In the original German, the subtitle is on the Socialist Restructuring of Humanity. In the 1945 American translation, it's now towards a self-governing character structure. Socialism has disappeared. Back in 1935, once Reich was lecturing at Oslo University in Norway, he began his first direct laboratory experiments summarized in the article Experimental Results on the Electrical Function of Sexuality and Anxiety. You can find that article in all of which I defer to Professor James Strick, who will share about this and much more after lunch. At the end of 1936, Reich wrote of a tension he felt between his longing to make a difference on the political realm and his new and exciting scientific empirical research. In a diary entry at the very end of 1936, 14th December 1936, he writes, "I am confronted with a question. Can the real sexual political task at hand be combined with my scientific work on a long-term basis? It is obvious that my scientific work is more important." A number of factors led Reich to this dilemma. By this point, he had cultured bions. And again, Professor Strick will have to explain what culturing a bion is, but this was incredibly important. Also, at that point, Reich had acquired a really sophisticated, state-of-the-art microscope, which allowed him to see interior motility within bions. Very important. At the same time, he was in conflict with his partner slash wife. I don't know if that's a Freudian slip. Reichian slip. Elsa Lindenberg. He and Elsa were conflicting, and at one point she refers to filthy sex pole. And the following day, he told Elsa that he was finished with sex pole. At the end of 1936, his last entry in his diary was, "The temptation to put an end to all of this filthy politics is too great. But then, what was the purpose of those 15 years?" And this sounds similar to that passage when he said he was still attached to the Communist Party, even long beyond he should have been, because it was a home for him. With the new year, 1937, Reich gave up editing the journal, the Zeitschrift. He stopped editing it and gave it over to Sigurd Hur. Did I say Hur? Do we have any Danish people here? That year, Reich wrote in addition to Sexual Struggle of Youth, it was like an insert to be put into the pamphlet, and then it was published in the Zeitschrift. In it, he completely disassociated himself with the word communism. Not Marxism, but communism. And this is a very important document in the Zeitschrift.
And this is what year?
This is 1937, 1938. It was published in 38, he wrote it in 1937. Yeah. And in 1938, again, in his journal, he announced a new version of the Sexual Struggle of Youth to be called the Sexual Rights of Youth. And you can read that in the Children of the Future. As Professor Dr. Lewis pointed out, Children of the Future is a compilation, and it includes this piece. The Sexual Rights of Youth is a much shorter version of what you might call the Soviet version of the Sexual Struggle of Youth. That was the more Soviet version. But the new Sexual Rights of Youth still included the following passage. This sexual suppression of the children by their parents, to which is added the intellectual suppression of the school, the spiritual stultification by the church, and finally the material suppression and exploitation by employer of employee, is the primary source of youth people's emotional and sexual misery. So he's still a good Marxist at this point. With its reference, that's evident with the references to material suppression and exploitation. And then after this, Reich writes a new book, or pamphlet, called The Natural Organization of Work in Work Democracy. And that banner from Communism to Work Democracy is the title of the book. And in it, he is still a socialist, but now he has a whole new vision of fascism. Previously, fascism was identified as part of a political movement, like the Nazis, or the actual fascist movement. The word comes from an actual movement in Italy. But now Reich writes, fascism exists in our very being. It is now a characterological thing.
Fascism exists in our very being. In man's fear of happiness, which turns into romantic dreams,
in his helplessness and irresponsibility, in the education of life by irrational feelings and actions, in the art of lying, fraud, circumvention, whose peak is reached in diplomacy and politics. Fascism is the abomination of human structure in the form of revolutionary ecstasy, a compromise between the most sacred yearning and brutality formed in millenniums of human oppression. Fascist mentality and sentimentality manifest themselves in the pedagogical arrogance of helpless and authoritarian teachers and parents. So topical for this moment in our history of our species. I added that.
I really appreciate you doing it. But now you have to add 3 seconds. This was... I still have 5. I think we're going to make it. That way of seeing fascism as characterologically structured rather than politically ideological calls into question the efficacy, the viability of any political activity. It is in the natural organization of work that Reich's banner phrase, which you can still see at the conference center at Orgonomy, work, not politics, occurs. In the natural organization of work, he says the most essential demand of the new movement will be, I went away from the microphone, he put it on my coat and I threw it away. I hope you can still hear me. The most essential demand of the new movement will be make an end, finally, make an end to all politics. Let's stand real work for our social life. And then shortly after that, whoops, he says, the conception of socialism has altered. For it no longer means a party conviction, but practical, real, and honest work for the task of life. We started with preventing neuroses by radically changing an alignment of the family drawn out of revolutionary left politics, and we end with the end of politics. And if so, how are we going to change the roots of what Reich soon after came to be called the emotional plague? It's not as if patriarchal authority has faded away. Sadly, it is all too prevalent. And I don't need to give you good examples, but I have statistics if you want, say about spousal abuse in the United States, 20 every minute in this country, and that 70%, this one really blew my mind, 70% of Americans agree in 2012 it is sometimes necessary to discipline a child with a good, hard spanking. Such spanking, of course, is illegal in many countries in the world, but not in the United States. Spousal abuse, child abuse, both are evident. And if we widen our scope, not just the United States or Europe, but globally, this is all too painfully clear. I would suggest that part of the ideology behind this, all of the pervasive conservative religions, with the spare the rod, poisonous pedagogy, and the demand that males protect their women, quote unquote, by men ruling the roost, is at the source of this. And on top of all of that, every dominant religious system continues to sow confusion about sexuality. In the original 1933 Mass Psychology of Fascism, roughly half of the text was devoted to the harmful role of religion. Chapter 6 in the original is entitled, quote, "The Church as the International Sex Political Arm of Capitalism." The Church is the international sex political arm of capitalism. Following Marx, Reich argued that religion serves to divert attention away from one's present-day misery, and with its promise of eternal reward. And he goes further, maintaining that psychoanalysis has proven that religious experience has the same effect on the autonomic system as do drugs. And you can find a good passage in the Mass Psychology of Fascism saying that, if you wish to ask more questions. As for patriarchy, in the same section of the Mass Psychology of Fascism, Reich writes, both patriarchal family attitudes and mystical attitudes are the basic mass psychological elements of fascist and imperialist nationalism. Thus, the fact that mystical education prepares the soil for fascism is demonstrated on a mass psychological scale when a social crisis sets the masses in motion. 1 minute? Holy moly. Well, I was then going to talk about, I could borrow from my 50 minutes, I was going to talk about the obvious devastation facing us now, namely the climate crisis and the way in which religion is reinforcing it. I don't know if you know this, but something like a third of evangelicals deny climate reality, and we know our supposed president denies the reality, and well, blah, 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 I could go on. Actually, you know what, I do have more to say, but I would rather just engage. You were patient enough to listen to me read, which I don't read, but I wanted to get through it, and I didn't quite get through my 1 minute. You must have read more slowly. I'm joking. So, I will say by saying, we're in deep shit.
People haven't spoken yet.
Yeah, first, you haven't spoken.
Yeah,
Say it loud or I have to repeat it.
Dr. Sobey, in the talk he gave in the early 90s, made a statement that he went to see Dr. Reich in Washington, D.C. Early in 1957, right before he was in prison. I think that was in March of 57. And Dr. Reich at that time said to him, Dr. Sobey, something to the effect that, remember, I'm still a Marxist.
Yep.
Now that's a proved to be a very controversial statement in the whole autonomy community and everything else. And I wondered what you thought he meant by that.
It doesn't give me any pause. I don't particularly care about the Orgonomy community.
No,
The truth is that Reich remained a Marxist always. At times he massaged it, or even, I would say, hid it, after he was attacked and arrested in 1941 as an enemy alien. And there are other passages there. You have to see my whole book where I lay out this whole history. But I think, even though Marx at one point says, I'm not a Marxist, and Reich at one point says, I'm not a Marxist either, but you know, and again, the controversy here is what do we mean by Marxist? And so arguing over a word is not particularly helpful, but the concepts are where he recognized that the misery that human people live that's due to capitalism, he never let go of that concept. However, you cannot talk about economics without talking about sexuality and sexual repression. Professor Koblenzer, please, Dr. Koblenzer.
As a member of many organizations that function on fulfilling a task and making decisions, I have trouble understanding doing away with politics, what that even means. When people may disagree about things, may have different access to power, and so what does that mean?
Well, that was the part that I had to short because I'm talking. I think what he means is that the dance of politics, I mean, let's look at it. Our dance of politics has to do with what majority of people are going to vote for something. And from Reich's point of view, that is not democracy. That is faux democracy, or illusion. Real democracy involves work. It involves working together and doing things. On the other hand, there is a reality and there is a politics, and the difference between who gets elected obviously makes a difference. And Reich, Reich always voted. He always voted. At one point, he told Dr. Sobey to vote whoever's not in power, just to keep things going. I can't do that. I've been voting since 1964. I can tell you I am pretty strict politically. I never voted for certain things, and always voted. Okay. Other people in the group who haven't had a chance to speak. Hold on one second. We got to ask who hasn't had a chance to speak yet. Yes, please.
Just kind of follow up on this question. I'm curious in terms of power structures in his inner group and how he, in his inner circle, can you tell us something about how he wields his own power and authority? Because I think that is related to the political question. I'm curious about that. And, you know, was he, did he practice what he preached
Did he practice what he
in his
preached?
circle?
Yeah, I think he practiced what he preached up until a particular point where he felt that work democracy was no longer appropriate. At one point, there's a passage, Strick, remind me if you would, that passage, if you feel comfortable sharing with me, 1950, he's in prompt conversation, and he says, forget about work democracy, we're at war, or something like that. What do you call that?
Yeah, that's sometime in the early 1950s.
Yeah, in 1950. His general modus or general way of doing was work democratic. If you were a new laboratory assistant, he would say, okay, you come in, he would say, what do? He wouldn't say anything. He said, here's a microscope, here's a slide, see what you can see. And he would not order people about. And people would find their niche. They would find something that they were good at, like Sharaf, Myron Sharaf. He was a translator, and he did a lot of translation. Other people did, you know, organizing the archives. I mean, it was all kinds of stuff. People found their niche. He said at one point, I'm the head of the Orgonomy Institute. If someone comes along who could do a better job, that'll be the head. So he didn't believe in voting in that way, and the only time you see an instance of that is when they found the foundation. They had to vote because legally they were required to vote. But that, so I think there are ways to engage democracy other than what for me is a dance that goes on every day where money talks, nobody walks, or something like that. Anyone else who hasn't had a chance to ask a question first? Connie, you look puzzled.
Well, what I felt was an important part of work democracy was Reich's idea that when people work together, everybody keeps responsibility from that part of the work that they have been working on personally.
Yeah.
So when you're going to try to set up a democratically run work environment, the plumber talks about his job where he has knowledge and authority. And he is given maybe more influence in that arena than everybody else because he knows what he's talking about.
Exactly.
And that, I think, is very key because you set up your political systems differently. So even if you just take this situation right now where our health system is such in chaos, okay, physicians are not in any way, shape, or form defining how this is happening. Okay, it's being defined for us. And as a consequence, it's horrifically disorganized. And there's no reflection on our need as professionals to serve our patients. And that's an example of where I think work democracy could completely rework our healthcare system.
If we read, wait one second. If we read the whole of Natural Organization of Work and Work Democracy, the first part of which is in Ergonomic Function number 7, right there, you can purchase it for $35 or something like that. Very important new journal that is both English and Spanish. Get it? That's the first part of it. Reich's approach was what's called anarcho-syndicalism. That is, people who know a particular kind of activity make decisions for that kind of activity. Yes, Dr. Lewis, please.
An example of work democracy comes specifically from Dr. Sobey's experience. Dr. Sobey, who did not like to write and publish, was assigned by Dr. Reich to do research on tuberculosis. The article is available. He did a study of 6 cases of tuberculosis under Reich's, authorization. Wrote it up. At one point, he was confused about what he was finding. He came to Dr. Reich and said, "Well, Dr. Reich, what do I do?" And Dr. Reich said to him, "I don't know." He said, "Why would I ask you to do the work if I knew the answers? You're now going to be the authority or the person who can tell us what you know." That was, according to Dr. Sobey, how. On the other hand, if it came to something that Reich felt he had absolute authority in and absolute knowledge of, he had no hesitation to say, "I know, and you're wrong. You'll do it this way because that's the way it is."
Thank you. I think that's an important
Time
point.
for one more,
That figures in. Yes.
one more question.
He's on the job. Go ahead.
It seems like Reich's theories weren't palatable in the world, and he didn't find a home. Do you know of any country that he kind of looked at as an ideal, or society as an ideal that he could, fit into more comfortably?
Well, initially, he, like everyone, was enamored by the revolutionary changes in Russia in 1917, where you did have something analogous to anarcho-syndicalism, where, the bakers did this, and then Lenin came into power and said, "All power to the Soviets," because the word Soviet is council. But that's when everything got organized, and that was the end of it. I don't know. He read anthropology carefully. If you read The Invasion of Compulsory Sex Morality, you'll see him looking at life in the Trobriand Islanders and their economics. There's a book by Malinowski called Orgonomy.
Argonauts of the Pacific.
Say that.
Argonauts of the Pacific.
Argonauts of the Pacific, which looks at the economic conflicts or differences between the Trobrianders, who are sex affirmative, and other tribes or villages or communities which are not sex affirmative. And so in that book you see that, and we can do it. We can do it here, create that kind of work democracy. The problem that gets in the way is our shit, our distress, our patterns, our habits, and our tendencies to give them value or power over us rather than we over them. And so that is what gets in the way all the time. People have already done.
A couple minutes of brief comments.
I just want to, Dr. Reich's favorite parable, which he shared with A.S. Neal, you go to the Letters of Reich and Neal, which is a wonderful book, a record of a friendship, which is available, was that one of the Satan's devils comes down from earth saying, "They've discovered the truth on earth, Master." And Satan simply looks at him and says, "Oh, that's not a problem. That happens all the time. We just send someone up there to organize it." So that gives you an idea. Reich thought that was the most profound insight that he had ever come across, the letters of exchange between him and Neal. And then they get into an argument who actually told the joke first.
Final, Dr. Strick?
We had a conference on the work democracy ideas and the writings that Reich did on work democracy this past summer up at the Wilhelm Museum. And I know that at least some of the papers from that conference are going to be published sometime next year in a volume of the Annals of the Institute for Organic Science. So if you want to read more on that subject and you weren't able to be there this summer, want to see some of those papers, I know that's going to be available sometime next year.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Bennett. Thank you very much. That was great. We're going